The Guardian just published an article on Tuesday, April 2nd. So 2 days ago. Not too bad. Not too bad. We're not doing too bad in the world of timelines here. The reason I bring this up is because we just talked about we just had a few sessions on the brain waves, right? And how the using of the 40 hertz brain activation, external brain activation with sound or light actually affects the brain. It affects the fluid movement, this lymphatic movement, the movement of the cerebrospinal fluid through the brain, cleaning out the toxins. And this research was shown at from MIT, recently done, and so we covered that paper. And specifically, right, this 40 hertz, right, they were specifically looking at that gamma, the gamma frequency, the really rapid brainwave frequency. Anyways, I'm going to read it. I'm going to read parts of it. The article is The New Science of Death. There's something happening in the brain that makes no sense. So I love it. I love it. There's the new science of death. There's something happening in the brain that makes no sense. I like this article a lot because it touches on a number of different things. Number one, it touches on the fact that very few people are studying death. Very few people are studying this process that every single one of us is going to go through, but yet we don't know anything about, right? And some people, they say in the article, it's, well, you're going to die anyway, so who cares? I think if we took that perspective on a lot of things, well, your arm got chopped off, so why do we care about regenerating limbs or parts of bodies that have been damaged? We wouldn't really be doing research in many fields if we kind of had that mentality of, well, you're going to die anyway, so who cares? Well, if you don't do the research, you don't know. I mean, simply put, if we had an a priori assumption of what we're going to find out in the research, there'd be a lot of discoveries that we would never imagine a priori what is going to come through the research. That's the point of doing research, right? So to me, that those sorts of arguments are absolutely, they just make no sense. The other one is that, there's a lack of funding in this, despite the fact that we are all going to go through it. And anytime we talk about, anytime people bring up, and I've noticed this myself, anytime we bring up concepts such as consciousness, that there's very little funding going into these sorts of things from the government, because it's sort of like, okay, that we can't really study consciousness. We don't really have a model to study. We want to study genes and molecules and cells and, things like that. And so the funding for this sorts types of research is mostly coming from private firms, private investors, private, entrepreneurs, or people who donate, because sometimes, there might not be any return on your money. You're just you're going out and you're discovering things. So it's not like, oh, I'm going to invest, $10,000 and I'm expecting a return of $20,000 because you're going to make this product. Sometimes it's just the research, and that's what happens. So this article kind of touches on a number of those things. But new research into the dying brain suggests the line between life and death may be less distinct than previously thought. And so they go into near-death experiences, and I highly recommend you read it all. There are a few kind of things that I'm going to pull out here. Patient 1 was 24 years old and pregnant with her third child when she was taken off life support. It was 2014, a couple of years earlier. She had been diagnosed with a disorder that caused an irregular heartbeat. And during her 2 previous pregnancies, she had suffered seizures and fainting. 4 weeks into her 3rd pregnancy, she collapsed on the floor of her home. Her mother, who was with her, called 911. By the time an ambulance arrived, patient number 1 had been unconscious for more than 10 minutes. Paramedics found that her heart had stopped. After being driven to a hospital where she couldn't be treated, patient 1 was taken to the emergency department at the University of Michigan. There, medical staff had to shock her chest 3 times with the defibrillator before they could restart her heart. She was placed on an external ventilator and pacemaker and transferred to the neurointensive care unit where doctors monitored her brain activity. She was unresponsive to external stimuli and had massive swelling in her brain. After she lay in a deep coma for 3 days, her family decided it was best to take her off life support. It was at that point, after her oxygen was turned off and nurses pulled the breathing tube from her throat, that patient number 1 became one of the most intriguing scientific studies in recent history. For several years, Gimo Borgini, I probably am mispronouncing that name, but I apologize, a professor of neurology at the University of Michigan, had been troubled by the question of what happens to us when we die. She had read about near-death experiences of certain cardiac arrest survivors who had undergone extraordinary psychic journeys before being resuscitated. Sometimes these people reported traveling outside of their bodies towards overwhelming sources of light where they were greeted by dead relatives. Others spoke of coming to a new understanding of their lives, of encountering beings of profound goodness. Borgine didn't believe the content of those stories were true. She didn't think the souls of dying people actually traveled to an afterworld. But she suspected something very real was happening in those patients' brains. In her own laboratory, she had discovered that rats undergo a dramatic storm of many neurotransmitters, including serotonin and dopamine, after their hearts stop and their brains lose oxygen. They fail to state in this article that there is also an increase in dimethyltryptamine, DMT, which is a hallucinogen that's found in plants and toads that's used for religious purposes. They keep that out for some reason. I don't know why. It should actually be in there. Some wondered if humans' near-death experiences might spring from a similar phenomenon, and if it was occurring even in people who couldn't be revived. Dying seemed like such an important area of research. We all do it, after all, and that Borgine assumed other scientists had already developed a thorough understanding of what happens to the brain in the process of death. But when she looked at the scientific literature, she found little enlightenment. To die is such an essential part of life, she told me recently, but we knew almost nothing about the dying brain. So she decided to go back and figure out what had happened inside the brains of people who died at the University of Michigan Neurointensive Care Unit. Among them was patient number 1. It goes into some of the histories of dying, and since the 1960s, advances in resuscitation have brought people back, essentially. So we're getting about 10 to 20% of those people brought back after being resuscitated had stories of some near-death experience in which they felt their souls or selves departing from their bodies. A handful of those patients even claimed to witness from above doctors attempting to resuscitate them. According to several international surveys and studies, 1 in 10 people claim to have had a near-death experience involving cardiac arrest or a similar experience in circumstances where they may have come close to death. If you look at that, that's roughly 800 million souls worldwide. Quite incredible. As remarkable as these near-death experiences sounded, they were consistent enough that some scientists began to believe there was truth to them. Maybe people really did have minds or souls that existed separately from their living bodies. So it goes into kind of looking at near-death experiences, the field of near-death studies. I believe a journal was actually started for near-death experiences, but by 2015 there was still little answers, and that's when this professor, together with several colleagues, took the first close look at the record of electrical activity in the brain of patient 1 after she was taking off life support. What they discovered in results reported for the first time last year was almost entirely unexpected and had the potential to rewrite our understanding of death. I believe what we found is only the tip of a vast iceberg. What's still beneath the surface is a full account of how dying actually takes place, because there's something happening in there, in the brain, that makes no sense. They're looking at the first sense of a near-death experience around 1740. A French military physician reviewed the case of a famous apothecary who, after a malign fever and several bloodlettings, fell unconscious and thought he had traveled to the kingdom of the blessed. The physician speculated that the apothecary's experience had been caused by a surge of blood to the brain. But between that early report and the mid-20th century, scientific interest in near-death experience remained sporadic. In 1892, the Swiss climber Albert Heim collected the first systematic accounts of near-death experiences from 30 fellow climbers who had suffered near-fatal falls. In many cases, the climbers underwent a sudden review of their entire past, heard beautiful music, and fell in a superbly blue heaven containing rosetta cloudlets, small little clouds. Heim wrote, "Then consciousness was painlessly extinguished, usually at the moment of impact. There were a few more attempts to do research in the early 20th century, but little progress was made in understanding the near-death experiences scientifically. Then in 1975, an American medical student named Raymond Moody published a book called Life After Life. That's an interesting book. He actually distilled the reports of 150 people who had had intense life-altering experiences in the moments surrounding a cardiac arrest. They started the Journal of Near-Death Studies, but near-death studies was already splitting into several schools of belief, whose tensions continue to this day. One influential camp was made up of spiritualists, some of them evangelical Christians, who were convinced that near-death experiences were genuine sojourns into the land of the dead and divine. As researchers, the spiritualists aimed to collect as many reports of near-death experience as possible and to proselytize society about the reality of life after death. Moody was their most important spokesman. He eventually claimed to have had multiple past lives and built a psychomantium in rural Alabama where people could attempt to summon the spirits of the dead by gazing into a dimly lit mirror. The second largest faction of near-death researchers were the parapsychologists, those interested in phenomena that seemed to undermine the scientific orthodoxy that the mind could not exist independently of the brain. Many of them were physicians and psychiatrists who had been deeply affected after hearing the near-death stories of patients they had treated in the ICU. Their aim was to find ways to test their theories of consciousness empirically and to turn near-death studies into a legitimate scientific endeavor. Finally, there emerged the small contingent of near-death researchers who could be labeled as physicalists. These were scientists, many of whom studied the brain, who were committed to a strictly biological account of near-death experiences. So you can see the variety of differences. Today, there is widespread sense throughout the community of near-death researchers that we are on the verge of great discoveries. Charlotte Marshall, a neuroscientist at the University of Liège in Belgium, who has done some of the best physicalist work on near-death experiences, hope we will soon develop a new understanding of the relationship between internal experience of consciousness and its outward manifestations, for example, in coma patients. We really are in a crucial moment where we have to disentangle consciousness from responsiveness and maybe question every state that we consider unconscious, she told. All right. As more and more people were resuscitated, scientists learned that even in the acute final stages, death is not a point, but a process. After cardiac arrest, blood and oxygen stopped circulating through the body. Cells begin to break down, and normal electrical activity in the brain gets disrupted. But the organs don't fail irreversibly right away, and the brain doesn't necessarily cease functioning altogether. There's often still the possibility of a return to life. In some cases, cell death can be stopped or significantly slowed. The heart can be restarted and brain function can be restored. In other words, the process of death can be reversed. It is no longer unheard of for people to be revived even 6 hours after being declared clinically dead. In 2011, Japanese doctors reported the case of a young woman who was found in a forest one morning after an overdose stopped her heart the previous night. Using advanced technology to circulate blood and oxygen through her body, doctors were able to revive her more than 6 hours later, and she was able to walk out of the hospital after 3 weeks of care. In 2019, a British woman named Audrey Schumann, who was caught in a snowstorm, spent 6 hours in cardiac arrest before doctors brought her back to life with no evident brain damage. Wow. They talk about a Netflix documentary released called Surviving Death. I highly recommend reading the whole article. I'd like to get to the point here. This is interesting. In order for this, something else, near-death experiences have to happen during death after the brain shuts down. To prove this, parapsychologists point to a number of rare but outstanding cases known as veridical, I guess, near-death experiences in which patients seem to report details from the operating room that they might have known only if they had conscious awareness during the time that they were clinically dead. Dozens of such reports exist. One of the most famous is about a woman who apparently traveled so far outside her body that she was able to spot a shoe on a window ledge in another part of the hospital where she went into cardiac arrest. The shoe was later reportedly found by a nurse. At the very least, Harney and his colleagues have written such phenomena are inexplicable through current neuroscientific models. Yes. So, we need to understand this. This is clearly a phenomenon that occurs. And what people are trying to do is they're trying to study now the activity of the brain. Perhaps the story to be written about near-death experiences is not that they prove consciousness is radically different than what we thought it was. Instead, it is that the process of dying is far stranger than scientists ever suspected. The spiritualists and parapsychologists are right to insist that something deeply weird is happening to people when they die, but they are wrong to assume it is happening in the next life rather than in this one. At least that is the implication of what Gimo Borgine found when she investigated the case of patient 1. In the moments after patient 1 was taken off oxygen, there was a surge of activity in her dying brain. Areas that had been nearly silent while she was on life support suddenly thrummed with high-frequency electrical signal called gamma waves. In particular, the parts of the brain that scientists consider a hot zone for consciousness became dramatically alive. In one section, the signals remained detectable for more than 6 minutes. In another, they were 11 to 12 times higher than they had been before patient 1 ventilators were removed. As she died, patient 1 brain was functioning in a kind of hyperdrive. For about 2 minutes after her oxygen was cut off, there was an intense synchronization of her brain waves, a state associated with many cognitive functions, including heightened attention and memory. The synchronization dampened for about 18 seconds, then intensified again for more than 4 minutes. It faded for a minute, then came back for a third time. In those same periods of dying, different parts of patient's one brain were suddenly in close communication with each other. The more intense connections started immediately after her oxygen stop and lasted for nearly 4 minutes. There was another burst of connectivity more than 5 minutes and 20 seconds after she was taking off life support. In particular, areas of her brain associated with processing conscious experience, areas that are active when we move through the waking world and when we have vivid dreams, were communicating with those involved in memory formation. So were parts of the brain associated with empathy. Even as she slipped irrevocably deeper into death, something that looked astonishingly like life was taking place over several minutes in patient's one brain. Those glimmers and flashes of something like life contradict the expectations of almost everyone working in the field of resuscitation science and near-death studies. The predominant belief expressed by Greason, the psychiatrist and co-founder of the International Association of Near-Death Studies, in the Netflix series Surviving Death, was that as soon as oxygen stops going to the brain, neurological activity falls precipitously. Although a few earlier instances of brain waves had been reported in dying human brains, nothing as detailed and as complex as what occurred in patient one had ever been detected. Given the levels of activity and connectivity in particular regions of her dying brain, Borgine believes it's likely that patient one had a profound near-death experience with many of its major features: out-of-body sensations, visions of light, feelings of joy or serenity, and moral reevaluations of one's life. Of course, patient one did not recover, so no one can prove that the extraordinary happenings in her dying brain had experiential counterparts. All right, the article continues, but the important, what I wanted to get to is again, coming back, right? These connections, these sort of things that are being made. And as we said in our previous episode, the research coming out, the research that is going to come out on brainwaves is going to explode over the next few years. And just in this, just in this article here, again, coming back to these gamma waves, these really high frequency waves that are present during our conscious life, and that they see bursts of this activity in states of deep meditation as well. And in states of focus, intensely focused attention, but also in the process of dying, right? That there's this maybe resurgence of these gamma activities, and how scientists are looking at the activation of these gamma waves by using external gamma waves, so essentially exposing ourselves to a certain frequency of sound, light, whatever it might be, to actually induce this in our own brains. Now, what I find interesting about this is it a human bias, or is it, is this sort of the default of consciousness, of this activity of dying, of death, right? Is there an intense synchronization of brain waves that occurs? Are there things throughout our life that we can do, right, to actually increase the likelihood that whenever we go, that we have a pleasant encounter? Right, that based on the speculation of visions of light, feelings of joy and serenity. I mean, wouldn't you choose to have that, right? A feeling of light or joy or serenity. If that's like, are we biased in saying that because people that have near death experiences come back and say that and report that, and we don't have the reports of people who do die, right? We don't have that report. But the people who come back, there's clearly that report. There's clearly a report of some sort of peace, some sort of serenity. And even the description of the research that was done of, people falling, having near death experiences, of falling, right? And thinking that they were, where was that part? Oh, I can't find it. But essentially, falling, falling through almost like this sort of heavenly, right? A heavenly blue, and then like a shift when the impact occurs, but doesn't seem like it was, like the actual fall was too psychologically traumatic. So I bring that up again because when we, these are topics that are interesting to me. And when we're investigating the nature of the self, when we're investigating, when we're doing these practices, asking ourselves, who am I? Learning from people that have had near-death experiences. What is actually, what are the areas of the brain that are active? This synchronization, this sense of global synchronization of the brain in near-death experiences, and we're going to get more and more. It's sort of like we are going to get more and more research coming into this, and it's going to be from individuals that are interested in asking this question, and especially looking at, as we start to explore more and more in the brain waves, of what brain waves and what those brain waves can bring to us in our life. Does it bring a sense of joy and serenity to us if we activate those brain waves? Does it actually help flow the cerebrospinal fluid more so that we're releasing toxins, we're getting rid of the toxins in our brain, and we can think more clearly? All these are going to be really important questions that are going to come up, and the associations of some of these findings with the process of dying is going to be really cool. Because it's kind of, I've mentioned it here. It's sort of like, we do this work so that in that moment we can be more comfortable with whatever shows up in that next moment, right? Which is the moment of dying, whatever that moment is. And yet, if we've done practices that have activated those brain waves and have caused the synchronization, maybe we'll actually be more familiar with that state as we're going through it. Like, oh, I recognize this. Is this what, this is a transition, right? Which is every moment. This moment, and now there's this moment, and now there's this moment. And here I am paying attention to this moment with the openness of awareness of what is, and being okay with it, right? As opposed to struggling, resisting, not accepting, and tensing, and then maybe not having such a pleasant life experience. So I know that was kind of long. We won't have time for a practice today, but these connections, I want to kind of bring you in to these connections between mindfulness practice, meditation practice, focused, intense concentration practice, external stimulation with sound and lights, electromagnetic fields, all right, and death, right? And really looking at these sort of interchanging brain waves and experiences that arise from those, and how, you know, we could alter our brain waves, right? And therefore alter our experience. And this is a conscious choice, right? And so this is really important, because just making those connections, keeping those connections vivid, and acknowledging those connections, between things like the process of dying and meditation, the process of dying, meditation, and clearing our brain to prevent toxins from building in our brain, and preventing cognitive decline and dementia.